LGBTQ people in the United Kingdom have been working for years to combat the rise in transphobia across the region. Despite some progress, the UK has become an increasingly unsafe and hostile place for transgender people. A new study shows that hostility reaches into the workplace. In the UK, 2/3 of transgender people say they keep their identity secret in the office, a sharp increase just over the past few years. From London, the world's Orla Barry reports on what's driving this.
Ashley Talbot remembers how she used to hide her identity at work. Talbot, a transgender woman, was working in tech support in Manchester in England. Most of her colleagues were male, she says.
And it was a very laddish culture. You know, all of the works dues were just let's go and get smashed on Stella kind of thing. And I also was acutely aware, because of some of the stuff that I'd witnessed there, I'd witnessed homophobia towards another one of my colleagues, and I knew perfectly well that if I was to come out and start living my truth and being a trans woman, it wouldn't go well.
So Talbot says she didn't come out to her colleagues. Instead, she gave her notice and left the job. Even today, almost a decade later, she still doesn't want to name the company. A recruiting firm recently conducted a survey and found that trans people are feeling less safe at work in the UK. 2/3 of respondents said they hide who they really are from work colleagues. But 5 years ago, only half said the same thing. Talbot says she's not surprised because the debate around transgender rights, she says, has gotten really ugly in Britain.
These things are being splashed across the front page so often, and really it is astonishingly often, given that the trans community is such a small percentage of the population, and yet for a period every single Sunday there was something in one of the big newspapers that was just overtly transphobic or misleading.
Back in 2018, the UK government decided to review the Gender Recognition Act. The law governs how trans people can get their gender identity legally recognised. The trans community wanted the process simplified, saying the guidelines were demeaning and invasive. But debate around proposed changes to the Act often descended into arguments about whether transgender women should have access to female-only spaces like bathrooms. These discussions are happening in other countries too, like the US. But Ashley Talbot says some of the loudest voices here in Britain are different.
It's exactly the same rhetoric, as in, you know, trans people are a threat, they're a danger to kids, etc. On one side of the Atlantic, you've got hardcore evangelical Republican Christians saying exactly the same thing as the people on the other side of the pond who are calling themselves progressive feminists.
Some of these feminists are well-known commentators, appearing in newspapers that span the political spectrum. They argue that sex is not a social construct, that people should not be able to change their gender on a birth certificate without a medical diagnosis, or that trans women be able to access female-only spaces. One of the groups Talbot names as being particularly vocal on the issue is called Fair Play for Women UK. It's an advocacy group that says it's working to protect the rights of women. I reached out to the director Nicola Williams for a comment, but she didn't respond to my request. Here she is talking to the BBC.
Biological sex doesn't change. People can identify with whichever sex they like, but fundamentally, someone's biological sex doesn't change. That matters to women because males are a sexual and physical risk to women. There are 500,000 women sexually abused every year by males.
Williams argues that women's refuges and female prisons should also only be accessible to those born female. Reform of the Gender Recognition Act was eventually shelved, but debates around the rights of trans people have continued. Sophie Lewis is a visiting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania's Centre for Research on Gender, Sexuality and Women. She says the political climate in the UK and in the US over the last few years has made things more difficult for the trans community, and the pandemic isn't helping.
So that combination of nativist, reactionary politics around Brexit and Trump, and then the conditions of a pandemic would, I think, contribute. I would expect to see people being more afraid to be out as trans.
Lewis says the law forced some trans people to move back in with their families and effectively back into the closet. She adds that feminists have been criticising the transgender community for a long time, and it's not just a British thing. Radical feminists expressed transphobic views back in the 70s during the second wave feminist movement in the US. In Britain more recently, high-profile writers like J.K. Rowling have also added fuel to the fire. The Harry Potter author published a lengthy essay linking her own experience of sexual assault with a concern over transgender access to women-only spaces. Sophie Lewis says the author's words were devastating for many of her transgender fans.
J.K. Rowling coming out in that particular way was extremely heartbreaking for trans kids, for trans adults who paradoxically saw themselves and saw a kind of secret sort of germ of their own queerness and transness in the stories of Harry Potter. This was an incredibly sad sense of betrayal.
Stonewall, a well-known LGBTQ charity, says it's also not surprised that trans people are finding things more difficult today than just a few years ago. Emma Cosman, head of workplace consultancy with the charity, says they had similar results when they examined attitudes at work before the pandemic.
So our research found that 1 in 8 trans people had been physically attacked by customers or colleagues in just the last year, just for being themselves at work. And 1 in 5 trans people wouldn't report transphobic bullying in the workplace.
Cosman says there are no good excuses for employers to not make an office more inclusive for trans workers. And the British government has a role to play too, she says. There's currently a petition calling for conversion therapy to be banned in Britain. Doing this would send a signal, Cosman says, that the rights of all LGBTQ people matter. For The World, I'm Orla Barry in London.